The hallway was quiet. Too quiet. Jordan sat alone on the wooden bench outside the principal's office. Backpack clutched to his chest. Eyes fixed on the speckled floor tiles beneath his sneakers. 12 years old? Clean record. Top 5% of his class. But none of that mattered right now. Because inside that office, Principal Wallace was fuming. And Jordan? He was waiting for judgment. It started with a pencil. Just a pencil. That morning, Jordan had borrowed one from a classmate. One of those fancy mechanical ones, the kind with the soft grip and built-in eraser. The owner, a white boy named Trevor, laughed and said, "You sure you know how to use this? My dad says your kind just steals stuff." Jordan didn't say a word. Just looked away. But the teacher heard it. And she did nothing. Jordan returned the pencil at the end of class. Politely. Respectfully. Like his grandmother had taught him. He even smiled. But somehow, by second period, the story had changed. Now Jordan had threatened Trevor. Had taken his property. And was disruptive. By third period, he was pulled out of class. By fourth, he was sitting on the bench. Still waiting. The clock ticked. Ticked louder. Then click. The door opened. Principal Wallace leaned out, tall and red-faced, eyes narrowed like Jordan was something he needed to scrape off his shoe. Inside. Now. Jordan rose. Slowly. Quietly. He walked into the office. Sat across the desk. Folded his hands. Just like his grandmother told him to, if anything like this ever happened. Wallace didn't waste time. "I've spoken to the teacher. I've spoken to Trevor's parents. Your behavior is unacceptable. You're being suspended for 3 days. Be grateful it's not more." Jordan blinked. "Sir, I didn't." Wallace raised a hand. "Don't. I don't want to hear excuses. I've worked in this district for over 20 years. I know trouble when I see it. You people, you always find a way to play the victim." The words hung there. You people. Jordan said nothing. His jaw clenched. But he didn't cry. Not yet. Wallace smirked. "Your grandmother's been contacted. Let's hope she knows how to raise a young man better than this." He turned back to his computer, dismissing the boy with a flick of his hand. But Jordan didn't leave. Not yet. He sat there, as if something was holding him in place. A memory. A promise. His grandmother had always said, "When they see your skin, they'll try to see less. But you hold your head up. Always." And he did. Until the door opened again. And everything changed. The door creaked open. Slowly. Deliberately. And in walked a woman. Not rushed. Not loud. Just steady. She wore a long beige coat. A wide-brimmed hat deep blue. Matching her scarf. Matching her presence. She walked like someone who knew how to command a room without ever raising her voice. Principal Wallace didn't even look up at first. "Take a seat," he said, flipping a folder. She didn't. He glanced up, then paused. This wasn't what he expected. No messy hair. No house slippers. No shouting. Just calm eyes. A purse clutched in one hand, and something pinned to the lapel of her coat. He squinted. "Can I help you, ma'am?" The woman set her purse gently on the chair next to Jordan. Then she looked at her grandson. Briefly. Softly. Then back to the principal. "I believe you called me," she said. Her voice warm but firm. "Jordan's grandmother." Wallace leaned back. His expression shifted. He was used to parents yelling, crying, begging. He wasn't used to this. "I did," he said. "And thank you for coming. I assumed you'd want to hear about what your grandson did today." She nodded. "I do. But I'd also like to hear what your school did." That gave him pause. "I'm sorry?" I said. She repeated. "What did your school do? When a child was insulted? When a teacher witnessed it? When my grandson was accused without a shred of evidence?" Her voice didn't rise. But the temperature in the room did. Wallace cleared his throat. The matter's been handled. I've spoken to everyone involved. We have a zero-tolerance policy here. Threats. Theft. Disruption. Whether we have footage or not, we act swiftly. Her eyebrows arched. No footage? Wallace straightened. We don't have hallway footage from that time. But Trevor's parents are highly respected donors. They wouldn't make this up. Jordan's hands curled into fists. But his grandmother touched his arm. Just once. Just enough. Then she turned back. So, just to clarify, she said, my grandson was suspended, with no evidence, based solely on the word of a child from a donor family, despite no one verifying any facts. Wallace's smile wavered. That's not how I'd word it. But it's what happened. Wallace stood now, trying to assert control. Look, I understand this is emotional for you. She didn't flinch. No, she interrupted. What's emotional is watching this boy come home every day and still believe this country will treat him fairly. He exhaled sharply. Ma'am, with respect, I don't appreciate you questioning my integrity. I've worked in education for 22 years. She cut him off again. Calm. But sharp. And I've spent 35 years protecting the Constitution. Now he blinked. I'm sorry. What did you say? She reached into her purse. Pulled out a leather wallet. Slim. Black. Official. She opened it. Slowly. And there, nestled inside, the gleam of gold. A pin. A card. An emblem. Supreme Court. Wallace's mouth opened slightly. Jordan sat straighter. She didn't gloat. Didn't explain. Just held the badge long enough for it to settle in. Then she tucked it away. I'm not here to flex power, she said. I'm here because one day, this boy will become a man. And how you treat him now will shape the man he becomes. Wallace didn't respond. But his face said everything. Still, he tried. I wasn't aware of your background. She raised a hand. The first time. I'm not interested in what you were aware of. I'm interested in what you were willing to assume. Then she turned to Jordan. Let's go. They walked out together. But just before she reached the door, she stopped. Looked over her shoulder. You'll be hearing from someone in D.C., she said. They'll want to discuss your zero-tolerance policy. Then she left. And Wallace? He sat down. Quiet now. For the first time all day. The story spread fast. By the next morning, whispers filled the teacher's lounge. Emails flew. Someone had seen the badge. Someone else had checked the registry. Jordan's grandmother was real. A Supreme Court staff attorney. 35 years of service. One of the few black women to ever hold her position. But Principal Wallace wasn't rattled. Not yet. He sat in his office, staring at the district email. The subject line. Request for immediate review of Jordan Williams' suspension. From a Justice Department address. He didn't open it. Instead, he picked up his phone. Get me the superintendent, he barked. Now. Across town, Jordan sat at the kitchen table, staring into his cereal. Spoon unmoving. His grandmother folded laundry nearby. You're not mad? He asked. She looked up. At you? No. At the system? Always. He nodded, but the weight on his shoulders stayed. Why did you show him the badge? She didn't answer at first. Then softly. Because he needed to know, silence doesn't mean weakness. Jordan didn't smile. But he understood. Back at the school, the pushback had begun. Wallace was in damage control mode. He called a meeting with the school board. He didn't mention the badge. He painted the story as an overreaction by an emotional family. He described Jordan as defensive, combative, even entitled. He said things like, "This isn't about race. It's about respect for authority. If we cave now, every parent with a complaint will claim bias." Some board members nodded. Some didn't. But then one voice spoke up. A woman. Board member Rodriguez. What about evidence? Wallace flinched. There wasn't any. But that's standard for these situations. It's about protecting the greater good. She raised an eyebrow. Or protecting certain students? The room tensed. Someone coughed. Wallace shifted in his chair. Later that night he drafted a memo. A slick, legal-sounding memo. In the interest of public trust and institutional integrity, the student's suspension will stand pending further investigation. He hit send. He thought that would be enough. It wasn't. The next day, a letter arrived on Wallace's desk. Hand-delivered. Embossed. Sealed. Supreme Court letterhead. To the Board of Education and Principal Wallace. Per federal guidelines on discrimination review and due process, we are initiating a formal inquiry into the handling of student Jordan Williams. His hands trembled slightly as he read it. But still, he pushed back. He called a press conference. Claimed he was under attack. That his record proved he was committed to equality. That the school was being bullied by people outside the community. He smiled for the cameras. But behind the scenes, he was furious. He sent a direct message to the superintendent. If we don't act fast, this school becomes a circus. I say we release Jordan's file. Show the public he's not as innocent as they think. A minute later, the reply came. Careful. This could backfire. But Wallace didn't listen. That night, a leak appeared on a local blog. Anonymous sources. Misleading quotes. Photos of Jordan cropped and twisted to make him look like a delinquent. Comments flooded in. Some were cruel. Some were worse. Jordan's family stayed quiet. But the storm was coming. 2 days later, the school board received another letter. From the Office of Civil Rights. An official review was underway. Witnesses were being called. And Jordan's grandmother? She was flying to D.C. to speak directly to the Secretary of Education. Meanwhile, Wallace called an emergency meeting. But this time, fewer people showed up. Some teachers refused to attend. Some parents wrote letters. Some staff quietly removed his photo from the wall in the hallway. And as Wallace sat in his office that night, staring at the blinking cursor on his laptop, a thought crept in. He might lose this. But still, he wasn't done fighting. Not yet. He leaned back, cracked his knuckles, and said aloud to no one. Let's see if she still wants to play this game when I call in the state board. What he didn't know was that she wasn't playing. She was preparing for checkmate. It began with a knock. A firm, deliberate knock on the glass door of Principal Wallace's office. He looked up from his laptop, eyes bloodshot from sleepless nights, and saw her. Again. The woman in the beige coat. The wide-brimmed hat. The quiet fire. Jordan's grandmother. She didn't wait for permission. She opened the door and stepped in. He stood up. Mrs. Williams, I don't know what you think you're doing. She raised one finger. And for the first time, he stopped talking. She closed the door gently behind her. Then she spoke. This school is under formal review. That includes your communications, your decision-making history, and your handling of racially charged incidents. Wallace tried to smile. It looked more like a twitch. This is a misunderstanding. I've been cooperating fully with the district. She stepped forward. Calm. Direct. And yet, she said, you leaked a child's record to the public. You pushed a false narrative about a boy with no disciplinary history. You claimed it was about order. But it was about control. He gritted his teeth. Do you have any idea how hard I've worked for this position? She looked him dead in the eye. Yes. And now you'll see how easy it is to lose it. She reached into her purse. Pulled out a folder. Thick. Official. Every tab marked. Witness statements, she said. Including one from the janitor, who heard Trevor's slur in the hallway. Including the teacher who stayed silent but has now come forward. She dropped it on his desk. He didn't touch it. She dropped another. Copy of the camera review request. You never submitted it. That's obstruction. Another folder. Emails from your district account. The ones where you discuss Jordan as a symbolic risk. We printed them. All of them. His face turned pale. Still, he tried. You think this will stick? I have friends on the state board. She didn't blink. I spoke with them this morning. Now he stepped back. Just slightly. She stepped forward. And pulled out her phone. Would you like to speak to someone from the Department of Justice? Or perhaps someone from the Office of Civil Rights? He said nothing. She dialed anyway. Angela? Yes. I'm sitting in front of Principal Wallace. We're ready. She placed the phone on speaker. A woman's voice filled the room. Firm. Sharp. Unapologetic. Mr. Wallace, this is Angela Price, federal investigator for OCR. Based on what we've received so far, your suspension protocol has violated multiple district policies and federal protections. You're now subject to a preliminary ethics inquiry. Wallace reached for the chair. Slowly sat down. She continued. You have the right to respond in writing within 48 hours. But be advised, your professional conduct is being evaluated by Washington, and the press has already filed a public records request. The call ended. Silence. Mrs. Williams picked up her phone. Placed it gently back in her purse. Then she leaned in, just enough for him to feel it. Do you remember what you said to my grandson? She asked. Her voice was low. Controlled. Deadly clear. You people always find a way to play the victim. That's what you said? Loud and proud. He didn't respond. But she did. Well now, it's your turn to explain yourself. She turned and walked to the door. Paused. And without turning back, she said, You suspended the wrong boy, Mr. Wallace. And you underestimated the wrong grandmother. Then she left. By the end of the day, the school district had gone quiet. Wallace canceled the staff meeting. He skipped lunch. And when the board requested a full accounting of his actions, he finally sent his reply. At 11:48 p.m., just 2 words. Legal counsel. He wasn't fighting anymore. He was bracing for impact. Because across town, in a modest home lined with books and framed certificates, Jordan's grandmother sat quietly at her kitchen table, sipping tea. She didn't celebrate. She didn't gloat. She simply wrote one final note in her journal. One boy. One bench. One badge. And the truth. The gymnasium was packed. Parents. Teachers. Board members. Journalists with notepads and cameras. The air buzzed, like right before a thunderstorm. At center stage sat 5 members of the school board. A long table. Microphones. Folders. And at the far end, Principal Wallace. His suit was freshly pressed. But his hands trembled. Next to him sat his attorney. Across the aisle, Jordan sat with his grandmother. He wore a pressed white shirt and tie. She wore the same hat. The pin gleamed on her coat. The board chair adjusted the mic. This public hearing is to review the conduct of Principal Wallace regarding the suspension of student Jordan Williams, and subsequent actions including breach of confidentiality, discriminatory language, and obstruction of review procedures. No one clapped. No one moved. A screen lit up behind them. Security footage. Audio clips. Email chains. Then, the teacher's statement. The janitor's testimony. The silent ones had begun to speak. One by one, the truths came out. What began as a boy accused of stealing a pencil had become something else entirely. A window into bias. Into silence. Into power unchecked. Wallace tried to defend himself. He claimed it was school protocol. That he was following orders. That he didn't mean it like that. But when the audio clip played, the one where he said, You people always find a way to play the victim, the room fell into a suffocating silence. Then murmurs. Then outrage. The board voted the same afternoon. 5-0. Wallace was relieved of his position. Effective immediately. A press release followed. The district issued an apology to the Williams family. Jordan's record was cleared. The incident was marked for training and oversight reform. And Wallace? His teaching license was placed under state review. That night, news anchors called it a turning point. But to Jordan, it was just school again. The following Monday, Jordan walked down the hallway. Not as a troublemaker. Not as a suspended kid. Just Jordan. Backpack on. Shoulders straight. Chin high. His classmates whispered. Some nodded. Some gave him quiet high fives. But he didn't gloat. He just walked forward. Until he reached a familiar spot. That bench. The one outside the principal's office. He paused. A janitor was there. Polishing the floor. Same one from before. The man looked up and gave him a wink. Good to see you again, counselor. Jordan smiled. Not yet, he said. But maybe someday. Across town, in that same quiet kitchen, his grandmother poured herself a cup of tea. She moved slowly these days. But her mind? Sharp as ever. She glanced at the morning paper. Local students' suspension sparks federal oversight reform. Then at the photo of her grandson on the front page. He stood tall. Confident. Proud. She folded the paper and set it aside. She didn't need headlines. She'd seen it all before. 50 years ago, she was that same child. Different city. Same looks. Same stares. And now, she had lived long enough to see the fight continue, but also, finally, begin to change. She walked to the living room. On the shelf sat her badge. She picked it up. Polished it. Then set it down next to a new frame. A photo of Jordan, at the school hearing. She whispered to herself. One day, they'll listen the first time. And for the first time in a long time. She smiled.